Йенс Петтер Нильсен, профессор департамента истории и религиоведения Норвежского Арктического университета в городе Тромсё. Родился в 1949 году в городе Альта. Окончил Институт истории в городе Осло. С 1990 года профессор Университета города Тромсё. Видный норвежский историк. Сфера научных интересов, история норвежско-российских отношений, история Норвегии и Европейского Севера. Внес большой вклад в научно-историческое обоснование концепции Баренцева Евро-Арктического региона, а после его учреждения в 1993 году в научную деятельность и международное сотрудничество историков в этом регионе. Был инициатором и координатором целого ряда научных проектов с российскими историками, в первую очередь из Поморского университета и далее из Северного Арктического федерального университета. Последний из них «Асимметричное соседство Норвегии и России 1814-2014» был завершен публикацией двухтомного издания, подготовленного коллективом норвежских и российских историков, где Нильсен выступил редактором первого тома. Презентация этого издания прошла в июне 2015 года в городе Осло. Автор около 300 опубликованных работ и 12 книг, часть из которых была издана в России. Почетный доктор Поморского государственного университета имени Михаила Васильевича Ломоносова.
Almost exactly 25 years has passed since I visited Arkhangelsk and the White Sea area for the first time. It was in the early summer of 1990, and quite recently I had been appointed professor at the University of Tromsø, which nowadays is also called the Arctic University of Norway. By that time, the perestroika in the Soviet Union had reached its apogee, and Mikhail Gorbachev would soon be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to end the Cold War. Among Norwegians who took an interest in Russia, an almost euphorian atmosphere prevailed. Maybe stronger than anybody else, the historians of North Norway felt that we stood on the threshold of a new epoch in the relations between Norway and Russia, with close contacts and collaboration like in the olden days. That is to say, as in the time of the so-called Pomor trade, when several thousand Russian Pomors from the White Sea area went to northern Norway each summer to barter Russian flour and timber for Norwegian fish. The Pomor area was obviously not forgotten in northern Russia either, 70 years after the revolution. And we envisaged a new era of openness and cooperation between North Norway and North Russia. That meant also cooperation in the field of history. In 1990, the first contacts between historians in Tromsø and Arkhangelsk had already been established. And in 1989, the Arkhangelsk historians had published a small book about the Vardø's Historia in connection with this small Norwegian town's 200th anniversary. This was a beautiful gesture that made an impression not only in Vardø but also in Tromsø, a lead, one may say, to closer contact. Back in Tromsø again, preparations started for what would become the first Norwegian-Russian history conference ever. It was to become the first in a long series of conferences in the years that followed. We timed this first conference to coincide with the 75th anniversary of the October Revolution, namely the 7th and 8th of November 1992. But before the event could take place, the USSR dissolved, and when the 12 invited Russian historians, most of them from Arkhangelsk, at last arrived in Tromsø, nobody wanted to speak about the Russian Revolution. Instead, the presentations turned on the second half of the 19th century and the pre-revolutionary period. This was as to be expected, since in the north, the late imperial period coincided with the golden age of the Pomor trade. The 19th century was now perceived as much more relevant for our own time than the Soviet epoch, when the borders between our two countries had been almost hermetically closed. This historiographical turn was in line with what happened in Russia at large in the beginning of the 1990s. Towards the end of the perestroika, in the epoch of round-table conferences in many Soviet cities, disclosures about the Stalin period clearly predominated. This was what occupied Soviet newspapers and the general public more than anything else. But quite abruptly, this came to an end with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The problems of Soviet history disappeared like dew before the sun. Instead, there was an increasing nostalgia among the general public for Russian national history, in particular the second half of the 19th century and the early 20th century. At the beginning of the 1990s, Norwegian-Russian cooperation between historians started not only in the north, but also between the Institute for Defense Studies in Oslo and the Institute for World History at the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow, with Sven Holtzmark and Alexei Komarov as the leading men. This cooperation was basically about publication of diplomatic correspondence between Norway and the Soviet Union. A few years later, the northern and the southern axis of Norwegian-Russian cooperation merged, and after many conferences and publications, in 2008 we joined forces in a large project called Neighborly Asymmetry, Norway and Russia 1814-2014, to commemorate the bicentenary of the Norwegian Constitution. Such a project could not have been carried through without the long period of preparation, through collaboration and building of confidence. And we could not have written such a work without the participation of leading historians at the Northern Arctic Federal University, like Andrei Rybniewski, Vladislav Goldin, Victoria Tevlina, Konstantin Saikov, Ruslan Davidov, and Tatiana Teterevleva. I will use this opportunity to thank all of them heartily for their important contribution. Yes, it is true that the initiative to this project was taken on the Norwegian side, not on the Russian. Maybe because it for a long period was easier to obtain grants for such a purpose in Norway. This advantage that we have over Russian colleagues is in itself a result of the asymmetrical relationship between the two countries. The interest in Russian history and society in Norway is doomed to be much greater than the interest in Norwegian history and Norwegian affairs in Russia. That goes without saying. So what is the professional justification for Norwegian and Russian historians writing a work like this together? And you can see the result of this project on the table there, the first and the second volume of Neighborly Asymmetry. In other words, can we become better historians through this kind of collaboration? I think there can be no doubt about that. One important concern that has been taken care of through this collaboration is to secure a better integration of Norwegian and Russian history in the north. During the Soviet epoch, not only the state border, but also our historiographies were almost hermetically isolated from each other. Very few Norwegian historians knew Russian, and many were of the opinion that there was little we could know for certain about Russia in connection with topics like this. The responsibility of a Norwegian historian stopped at the border to Russia, as it were. Russian historians, on the other hand, used only to a limited degree Western literature. Some because they didn't know foreign languages, others maybe for political reasons. There were, as you know, periods in Soviet history when excessive referring to Western sources was something you should avoid. So too often in both countries the historical account was based on sources and historical literature from one's own country only. And this was certainly not in accordance with professional norms, which are international in the sense that they are recognized by historians everywhere. being able to be corrected by others and approach a question from different points of view is a sine qua non of objective history writing. And being corrected by colleagues from another country is a way of escaping from what has been named the national captivity of historians. That is to say that you are bound to the confines of your own country or your own nation state. To fight this bad habit during the last decade, German and French historians have joined forces in writing textbooks on the history of the 20th century of the 20th century Europe. And these countries, Germany and France, have fought each other in 2 world wars during the 20th century. And they have indeed succeeded in writing such books together. And when this was possible, why shouldn't we be able to write the history of Russian-Norwegian relations together with Russian colleagues? All the more so since these 2 countries never have fought a war against each other. And I will say a little about the contents of the 2 volumes, the differences between them, and the overarching ideas on which they are based. The first volume is named Russland kommer närmare. Russia is getting closer, or Россия становится ближе in Russian. And it covers the period from 1814 until 1917 and the Russian Revolution. The second is called Naboer i frykt og forventning, neighbors in apprehension and expectations. Соседи в страхе и ожидании in Russian. And this volume covered the period from 1917 to 2014. They deal with 2 different epochs of our bilateral relations. One with a lot of contact between people on both sides of the border, and low tension on the interstate level. The other with modest interhuman contact, but with periods of high tension between the 2 states. And the project as a whole is called, as already mentioned, neighborly asymmetry. The relationship between Russia and Norway is asymmetrical, since Russia is the world's largest country and Norway a relatively small country, especially when it comes to population. Russia has for the last 200 years been a great power, Norway a so-called small state. These disparities have to a large extent been decisive of the relationship between the 2 countries. And the symmetry runs like a leitmotif through the 2 volumes. The neighborliness with Russia is a commanding fact in Norwegian history, while the closeness with Little Norway naturally has not a similar impact on Russia. Since Russia is so vast, its relations with most of its neighbor states is asymmetrical. But Norway's case is peculiar, since Russia's position as a great power never gave this country a hegemonic role vis-à-vis its neighbor at the Arctic Ocean. And being the lesser part can sometimes also be an advantage. The asymmetry, for instance, clearly explains why the study of Russia in Norway is more advanced than the study of Norway in Russia. It is simply more important for us to know Russia than the other way around. The disadvantages for the great power is also evident when it comes to its commitment to the North in certain periods. In the 19th century, the Norwegian government used great resources in order to integrate or tie the northernmost part of the country to the nation due to its fear of Russia. Russian authorities did not have a similar motivation for consolidating its hold of the so-called Murman coast, since Little Norway did not challenge Russia's sovereignty over this area, which borders Norway from the east. Therefore, the Murman coast, for a very long time, was left unattended by the Russian government and remained a desolate area. Permanent settlements appeared here only towards the end of the 19th century. That the relations between Norway and Russia were asymmetrical does not mean that Russia always was the stronger part. If we turn our attention from the interstate level to civil society, a converse picture appears. At this level, there is a tendency towards weakness on Russia's part, while Norway, for historical reasons, has a stronger organization of society from below, as well as a more even dispersal of social assets. The image of the Norwegian society in Russian liberal circles during the late 19th century and early 20th centuries was positive, at times verging on idealization. Norway was often represented as a flourishing democracy, which might serve as a model for other countries. Interestingly enough, during the second half of the 19th century, Finnmark, the northernmost county of Norway, was considered worthy of imitation on the Russian side of the border in the north. After the October Revolution, the wind blew in the opposite direction, however, and the Norwegian labor movement began to regard Soviet socialism as a model for Norway. It is in the high north of Europe that Russia and Norway met each other in the first place. And in Volume 1, an important theme is Norway's and Russia's gradual advance northwards and their efforts to establish themselves at the open Arctic Sea, economically, administratively, and culturally. Important topics in this connection is fishery and sea mammal hunting, the Pomo trade, which has already been mentioned, security policy, and military questions connected with the subarctic areas and the Arctic. Before 1917, Norway's contacting surface with Russia was almost exclusively in the north. And these interhuman contacts were both broad and many-faceted. Therefore, they predominate in Volume 1. In Volume 2, however, the center of gravity moves from interhuman or intersocial relations to interstate relations. This disparity between the volumes is unavoidable for two reasons. Firstly, the fact that interstate relations between the two countries were established only in 1905, when Norway broke away from the union with Sweden and attained full independence. Only then Norway got her own Ministry of Foreign Affairs and established diplomatic relations with Russia and with other states. In Volume 2, the center of gravity is also moved from the north to the south in the two countries. That is to say, from the northern peripheries to the capitals. Both the interstate relations and the contacts between the Norwegian labor movement and the Soviet Union were mostly handled in Oslo and Moscow, respectively. During the Cold War, the question of military security strongly impacted on the relationship between the two countries. And again, the North claimed a particular attention, both from Norwegian and Soviet authorities. The northern areas became a more important part of Norwegian-Russian relations than any time earlier in history. Secondly, for political and ideological reasons, the interhuman relations in the Soviet epoch were strongly restricted. While interstate relations were established towards the end of Volume 1, interhuman relations again becomes a central theme in Volume 2 towards the end of this book. This happened after the demise of the Cold War, the opening of the borders between the countries, and the establishment of the transnational Barents Euro-Arctic region in 1993. Security considerations have undeniably been an important component in Russian-Norwegian relations during these 200 years. Generally speaking, the security needs of a small state cannot easily be consistent with those of a great power with which it has a common border. At times, the power disparity makes it tempting for the great power to establish its position by force. However, a small state can use different internal and external strategies to avoid this, like Norway has done in its relations with Russia and the Soviet Union. Norway has sought safety through non-alignment and neutrality, in collective security arrangements like the League of Nations, and great power guarantees, like the November Treaty of 1855 and Norway's membership in the NATO alliance from 1949. Unlike Russia's other neighbors in the West, Norway has managed to remain outside this great power's sphere of influence. At the same time, it is a fact that Norway, during the Cold War, was the NATO state with the friendliest relations with the Soviet Union. Writing about this in neighborly asymmetry, we have taken as a point of departure the trend in the study of international relations referred to as constructivism, which emphasizes that state leaders are not steered by interests, but by concepts about interests. That is to say that they are formed by mindsets and political culture. This implies that security politics is steered by how the parties perceive one another, rather than what they stand for in reality. Negative stereotypes come into play here, but also positive concepts, such as, for example, the idea that Norwegian-Russian neighborliness has been peaceful and that there has never been a war between the two countries. In cases where there has been a war, between a great power and its small state, a neighbor, there may be a fear on the part of the smaller state that history might repeat itself. However, there may also be a fear on the other side, although many find it hard to believe that even an elephant can be afraid of a mouse. This unease on the part of the great power could also be linked to an awareness of the past. If you have subdued your neighbor once, how can you ever trust him again? Will he not, for this very reason, allow himself to be used by a rival great power? In Norwegian-Russian relations, there are no such memories from the past that undermine the mutual confidence between the two countries in such a fundamental way. The title of the first volume, Russland kommer närmare, Россия становится ближе, was chosen because the two neighbor countries really came closer to each other in different fields during the 100 years between 1814 and 1917. They did so even in a geographical sense. However strange this may sound. As I have already mentioned, the Murman coast of the Kola Peninsula, bordering Norway, had its first permanent settlements as late as the second half of the 19th century, while the main flow of contacts previously had been between northern Norway and the far more distant White Sea region, where most of the Pomor traders came from. In a report from 1896, however, Arkhangelsk governor Engelhardt wrote about the Kola Peninsula. I cite, "In these latitudes lie hidden forces which are only temporarily slumbering deeply. For the inner eye of the traveler, as in a mirage, a locomotive appears to be on its way here, which will awaken the dormant power and revive the silent, bleak, and empty region." If we continue in Governor Engelhardt's allegorical style, we could say that the Kola Peninsula was still a sleeping beauty, that in 1915-1916, shortly before the downfall of Tsarist Russia, the Tsar had a railway from central Russia to the Kola Fjord, the Murman Railway, built. Thus the foundation was laid, and then came the October Revolution, and Lenin, in the unlikely role of the prince, kissing Sleeping Beauty. This was the start of an industrial and demographic development on the Kola Peninsula, which accelerated immensely from the 1930s. In the course of a few decades, a new city the size of Arkhangelsk emerged in Norway's neighboring region in the north, namely Romanov-Murmansk or Murmansk. Russia had come closer. This feeling that Russia had come closer was also widespread among the Norwegian bourgeoisie in the years preceding the Russian Revolution. In January 1917, the president of the Norwegian Storting, Johan Ludvig Mowinckel, in an interview with the Russian newspaper, stated that the First World War had created a renewed interest for Russia in Norway. He added that the mutual understanding between the two peoples would grow with the strengthening of the constitutional order in Russia. Mowinckel expressed views that were widespread among Norwegian politicians and businessmen. Russia's belonging to the Entente and being an ally of Britain and France instilled a new confidence in Russia that had not been there before in Norway. And with the February Revolution and the fall of Tsardom, these expectations were in a way fulfilled. The February Revolution was a revolution that, according to many Norwegians, would strengthen democracy and the rule of law and make the Russian society more equal to the Norwegian. Russia would become a more predictable partner, both politically and economically. This optimism resulted in large Norwegian investments in Russia during the First World War, in particular in the sawmill industry, before the October Revolution came as a shock and put an end to these expectations. Soon all foreign investments in Russia became nationalized. A Swedish historian, quite recently reviewing the first volume of Neighborly Asymmetry, states that this book is a story of big expectations that did not come true, but were bitterly disappointed. He suggested also that in this respect, history is about to repeat itself. He underlines that the project Neighborly Asymmetry sprang from the demise of the Cold War and the establishment of the Barents region, which, just like the February Revolution in 1917, created great expectations of a new era of interhuman interaction, economic cooperation and interdependence across the Norwegian-Russian border. He characterizes this book as a worthy monument to these expectations, adding, however, that Russia's annexation of the Crimea and the Ukrainian crisis already has put an end to the belief that Russia and Europe can live in harmony with each other. I am not quite as pessimistic as my Swedish colleague, even if there is a reason to be worried about the international climate nowadays. There have been apprehensions lest the international tension could also bring the cooperation within the Barents region to an end. But that has not happened. Even if the contacts between Russia and Norway on the political and diplomatic level have been more or less frozen for a long time, in the north the interaction has not only continued, it has rather increased, at least in the field of science, culture, and people-to-people cooperation. The governments have, since the crisis started, allocated more money to the Barents cooperation in the north, as if assuring the other part that this break of relation is not wished for and should not be considered permanent. Let us hope that the situation will normalize little by little. In the meantime, I think it is what historians should do is to continue with business as usual. We should continue to cooperate. The Neighborly Asymmetry is now being translated into Russian, but the project is is more or less completed, and we have to initiate new projects. One of them is the history of the Northern Sea route, which is about to start with participants from Tromsø, from Arkhangelsk, from St. Petersburg, and also from Krasnoyarsk. We are planning a new project on scientific cooperation between Scandinavian and Russian scientists in the Arctic, and we are hopeful that it will be possible to get grants for this project. Then we have the so-called Kirkenes seminars for Norwegian and Russian historians, which had been organized every second year for a long period, and the next seminar will take place in Petrozavodsk in a few days from now on. So there are few indications that the cooperation between Norwegian and Russian historians established 25 years ago is withering away. There is also the question about recruitment to the field. Some of us who have participated in this cooperation for 25 years are getting older, but many of the authors who participated in Naval Symmetry are rather young. They are in their 30s or 40s. So I think we should not worry too much about the recruitment to the field either. So I will just say then that thank you for this opportunity to speak about a topic that is close to my heart. Thank you for your attention.